On the morning of September 12, 1683, the city of Vienna had run out of time. Its walls were breached in 2 places. Its defenders were down to fewer than 5,000 men who could still stand. Its people were eating cats. The Ottoman Grand Vizier had ordered the final assault for the next day. And then, over the hills to the northwest, a Polish army appeared. Vienna held. Europe changed. But it very nearly didn't, and the reason had almost nothing to do with the battle. Today we're going to follow one decision through 3 centuries. First, what actually happened in the summer of 1683. Then the single change that makes Vienna fall. And then the world it produces, all the way to the year 2026. Not a fantasy, a chain of consequences. In the spring of 1683, the largest army Europe had seen in a generation left Edirne and started walking north. Somewhere between 90 and 150,000 men, depending on who was counting and what they counted. At its head was Kara Mustafa Pasha, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, a man who had spent years arguing that the Habsburgs were weak, divided, and finally ripe. He wasn't wrong. Emperor Leopold I didn't wait for the siege. He left the city with his court on July 7th and rode west to Passau, and roughly 60,000 civilians left with him. Command of Vienna fell to Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, with about 15,000 soldiers and 9,000 armed civilians. His first act was to burn the suburbs outside the walls, so the Ottomans would have nothing to shelter in. Then he shut the gates. The siege began on July 14th, and it was not a siege of cannon fire. Vienna's walls were modern, angled and thick. Artillery bounced off them. So the Ottomans went underground. Their sappers were the best in the world, and for 8 weeks they dug tunnels under the bastions and packed them with gunpowder. The defenders dug counter-tunnels to find them. Men fought and suffocated in the dark under the city for 2 months. Above ground, dysentery killed more people than combat. By early September, Starhemberg was signaling for help with rockets fired into the night sky, because he had no idea if anyone was coming. On September 11th, the Berg Ravelin fell, and 2 breaches opened in the curtain wall. Vienna had days, at most. Here is the change, and it isn't on the battlefield. The army that saved Vienna existed because of a treaty signed in Warsaw in March, 6 months earlier, an alliance between Poland and Austria. That treaty was fought over. Louis XIV of France spent enormous sums bribing the Polish nobility to keep Poland out of it, because a weakened Habsburg Austria was worth more to France than a Christian victory. He lost that argument by a narrow margin. In our timeline, he wins it. Poland stays home. Jan Sobieski never marches. September 13, 1683. There is no army on the Kahlenberg. The assault goes in through both breaches at dawn. Starhemberg dies in the street fighting around the Hofburg. By evening, the standard of the Ottoman Empire flies over St. Stephen's Cathedral, and Kara Mustafa Pasha has done what no commander since Suleiman had managed. 200 miles west, Leopold receives the news in Passau and the Habsburg monarchy begins to come apart. Not because Vienna was its strongest fortress, but because it was its only legitimacy. Hungary's nobility, which had spent a century choosing sides between Vienna and Istanbul, chooses Istanbul. Bohemia declares for itself, and Kara Mustafa spends a brutal winter discovering the harder problem. Taking Vienna was one thing. Holding a city 800 miles from Belgrade, at the end of a supply road that freezes, is another. And this is where the story stops being about the Ottomans at all. Because the real winner of 1683, in this timeline, is sitting in a palace at Versailles. Louis XIV had been waiting his whole reign for the Habsburgs to be busy. Now they're not just busy, they're dying. French armies cross the Rhine in 1684, and this time nobody forms a coalition to stop them, because the coalition's paymaster no longer exists. The Holy Roman Empire, already a legal fiction, stops pretending. Its 300 German states split between French clients in the west and something new in the north. Brandenburg Prussia gets its great national story 40 years early. Not the kingdom that beat Austria, the kingdom that became the shield of Protestant Europe when the Catholic emperor collapsed. Prussian militarism doesn't need Frederick the Great to invent it. It arrives in 1690, and it arrives permanently. The other consequence is in the east. With Austria gone, and Poland neutral and shrinking, there is exactly one power left with a reason to fight the Ottomans on land: Russia. Peter the Great inherits the entire Eastern question by himself. Every war the Habsburgs fought in the Balkans, Russia fights instead, and wins slower, further south, and later. Which means the Balkans stay Ottoman for another century and a half. There is no Serbian uprising in 1804, no Greek independence in 1821, because the machinery that made those things possible, Austrian border provinces, European great power sponsorship, isn't there. And there is no Austro-Hungarian Empire, which means there is no Archduke to shoot in Sarajevo. The First World War, as we understand it, has no fuse, though a continent of Prussian and French armies finds another one soon enough. Smaller losses, too. Vienna's coffeehouse culture came out of sacks abandoned in the Ottoman camp. In this timeline, coffee still reaches Europe, but through Marseille and Amsterdam, and the café as a place where people sit and argue about politics belongs to France. So what does 2026 look like? Vienna is a city of 2.5 million on a contested river, the way Belgrade or Istanbul are, a place with 3 names, depending on who you ask. The language you hear in airports across the continent is French, not English, because the Anglo-American century needed a Europe that exhausted itself in 1914, and this Europe exhausted itself in 1750 instead. There are 11 countries between the Rhine and the Black Sea instead of 23. The Balkans are a single federal state and always have been, and no one there has ever heard of a place called Yugoslavia. Now the honest part, because every alternate history has a weak link and this one has a clear one. The Ottoman Empire in 1683 was not a rising power taking one more step. It was an empire whose land-grant military system was already failing, whose treasury was already borrowing, and whose provinces were already drifting. Vienna wouldn't have fixed any of that. It might have accelerated it. 100,000 men garrisoning a hostile city 1,000 miles from home is not strength, it's a bill. The strongest version of this timeline probably isn't an Ottoman Europe. It's a Europe with no dominant Catholic power at all, sorting itself out for 200 violent years, with Prussia and France doing most of the sorting, and Istanbul slowly running out of money in the background. Kara Mustafa Pasha, in our timeline, was strangled with a silk cord in Belgrade on Christmas Day, 1683, for losing a battle he should have won. He lost it because a bribe in Warsaw didn't quite land. What's the smallest amount of money you think ever changed the most history? Tell me in the comments. I read them all.